Today we're going to talk about Lovecraft's seventh story, in the order that I'm reading them, The Doom That Came to Sarnath. And this was written about a year after his mother was committed into an asylum. So this is in his first year of being alone, and one could say that, he was in his early 30s and he should be okay being on his own. But he had always been with his mother and always lived with her, so this was a big transition for him and, all the other family issues that he'd been having. So it is not too surprising that a key focus of this story is about doom. Doom, 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 and how nothing stays forever and there's always doom lurking around the corner, because this is just what his world has taught him. Interestingly, the first 6 stories all featured a hero, in essence him, going around and doing things, either being killed in castles or nearly killed in graveyards or so on. But this story is the first one that, at least in the order that I'm reading them, that there isn't a hero or any sort of main character. It's just a story about the doom of a people, because the people were a little too arrogant and therefore they all had to achieve doom. So let's take a look at this. We're starting at a point by a lake, and we're starting to talk about something that happened 10,000 years ago. So in our own human lifespan, 10,000 years ago would have been the days of hunter-gatherers. So it is way, way back in our history. But in this world, 10,000 years ago, there was a mighty city of Sarnath. It was a pinnacle of civilization back then, 10,000 years ago, which is completely gone now. So they're looking back 10,000 years as if us to our hunter-gatherer ancestors and saying there was a massive civilization and a beautiful city, and it's all completely wiped out. So before this city was built, so now we're jumping even further back in time, a previous 1,000 years, there was a gray stone city in this spot that just descended from the moon, fully built. And it came down from the moon with a bunch of people in it. Well, I say people loosely, a bunch of beings in it. And these beings were very odd and ugly. They were rudely fashioned. They had bulging eyes, pouting flabby lips, and curious ears. And they danced horribly. Now, part of what amuses me about this is that I love Lovecraft's descriptions. I love, the hieroglyphics on the monolith that are all shaped like octopus and fish and eels and things like that. And I love the descriptions of the different worlds that he has. And for him to say that they danced hideously, it seems a little like cheating. I mean, really, everyone should be able to dance the way they want to, is the kind of thought that I have when I see something like that. And also, he seems to really, really not like fishy people, because this whole pouting flabby lips and bulging eyes makes me think of like flounders and things like that. And again, he lived in Providence. Maybe he was just so grossed out by the fish markets there that his thought of ultimate evil was something that looked sort of fishy with curious ears, a fish with curious ears. So, in any case, these moon creatures that came down from the moon with their stone city, they couldn't talk, they just danced around hideously, and they worshipped a giant sea green stone idol in the shape of a giant water lizard. So they were water lizard worshippers. They danced hideously around, and they didn't talk to each other. And they lived their lives pretty happily. So I guess I don't see the horror of these happy fish people. But nearby people certainly thought that they were horrific. There were dark shepherd folk with fleecy flocks that started building little hunter-gatherer kinds of villages around the area, and then they decided that they really wanted to be where this great gray city was. And they became fixated on it. They thought that these people were evil because they were fishy looking. Their hate grew, and it was not less because they found the beings weak and soft as jelly to the touch of stones and spears and arrows. So it doesn't even sound like the fishy people ever bothered the hunter-gatherer dark people. They were just doing their fishy dances. They were soft as jelly, and so all of the young warriors of the shepherds said, "Oh, we want this land," and they all marched in and they killed them all. It doesn't even sound like the fishy people put up much of a fight. And then the hunter-gatherers pushed the queer bodies of the fishy people into the lake with long spears because they didn't want to touch them. So, very questionable in my mind what's going on. And, they're clearly not trying to make these warriors made out to be good people. They're just rampaging. They took over the city. They pushed all the squishy bodies into the water. and they pulled the giant lizard guy statue back to their own city because they wanted to celebrate having conquered them. So they took it back as a symbol of the conquest over the old gods, and then the next morning, the high priest of the hunter-gatherers was dead, as from some fear unspeakable, and he scrawled on the altar the sign of doom, D-O-O-M in capital letters. Now you would think that this would concern the hunter-gatherers, but no. Oh, and the idol vanished missing. So someone stole the idol back, scared the priest to death, and then he wrote the word doom. So maybe the people were afraid at first, but nothing happened, and many centuries came and went. Many generations later, only the priest and the old woman remembered about this whole doom thing, and this section of the world was so rich in minerals and jewels and everything else that they became very, very wealthy. So now it was the city of Sarnath that became great. So this is the one that we were talking about at the beginning of the story that perished 10,000 years ago. So we know it's going to die. We're just trying to figure out how it died. So these people of Sarnath had a great position on the edge of the lake. They had lots of minerals and everything. They got richer and richer. They sent forth conquering armies to subdue all the neighboring lands, and they became the capital of this whole kingdom here. The wonder of the world and the pride of all mankind was Sarnath the Magnificent. All right, so here we go. The next, we'll say, 3/4 of this story is just descriptions of the city. Now, I love Lovecraft in his descriptions. I'm like a Tolkien fan. I like describing moss and leaves and all that kind of stuff. But apparently I've discovered, now that we're on story number 7, that I really like his descriptions of natural things, especially when they're creepy and unusual, because it's something different than what I've read, in 80 billion other books over the years. But I get bored when he is just going line after line after line, for paragraph after paragraph, about details of architecture. He seems very obsessed with onyx and glazed brick and crystal lakelets and domes. They all have to have domes. There have to be temples and domes. Maybe he should have moved to Greece and lived in a world of temples and domes and lots of architecture, because that he would have been like super happy there. But we just get these really long descriptions about how marvelous were the palaces and the temples and the gardens. There were many palaces. They were so high that you might think that you were under the sky. They had vast paintings of kings and armies. Lots of mosaics everywhere. Lots of fountains. And there was a giant throne that was wrought of one piece of ivory, which he stole from a different book. It's a sort of a cool thing, because, ivory comes from tusks and teeth and things. So you think of ivory as something that is bounded by a natural creature and how large that creature got. So if you get a really massive piece of ivory, you start to wonder, well, what kind of a creature had a big enough tusk or something to be able to carve this single piece of ivory out of it? So there's many galleries and amphitheaters, and then, he's referencing the Colosseum and the kinds of things the Romans did, where they flooded things with water so that they could have watery fights. And then 17 tower-like temples. They have to be more temples, brightly colored stone, not known elsewhere. And, I appreciate that he's trying to describe how magnificent and wonderful this is, but he could have worked this into the story where, like, saying they had a party one night and it had this room with all of these features, and then they had a celebration another night. He could have worked it into the story instead of just doing this world-building dump, which is something when I'm mentoring my teens, I always warn them against, because people's eyes start to roll back in their heads when they're on paragraph 8, of the unending steps of shining zircon to the tower chamber, and the cryptic moon. And we're still going. There's more images of suns and moons and stars. There's gardens that are in the winter heated with concealed fires, in the summer that are skillfully wafted by fans, and waterfalls, music of rare birds. All right, finally we get to an action, a feast, which is in Sarnath, where they're celebrating the destruction of Ib, which was that city from 1,000 years ago in the time of Sarnath. And there's wine, song, dancing. Oh, so their dancing isn't horrific. Their dancing is good dancing. The other poor little lizard people's dancing was horrific dancing, because they were all squishy and stuff. And they gave honor to all the people who had conquered the city of Ib and the poor little squishy people. It says the kings would look out over the lake and curse the bones of the dead. You know, what did the dead even do? The dead just died. It's not like they were invading. So anyway, they sometimes saw lights beneath the waters of the lake, but they didn't care. They just laughed. They were the victors. The poor lizard people were the losers. And then as they got to the 1000th year, their feast was the biggest of ever. All sorts of people came in on horses and camels and elephants. And they all drank a lot of wine. And then, we have to go through the list of they ate peacocks from this place and young goats from that place, and the heels of camels, which really doesn't sound yummy at all, from a desert, nuts and spices. And there were platters of rubies and diamonds. And while they are all sitting there dancing and feasting and stuff, a high priest started seeing shadows that descended from the gibbous moon. Lovecraft really likes gibbous moons. It must be the shape, or maybe just the word gibbous. He likes to say gibbous. So the gibbous moon is shining into the lake, and shadows come down from the gibbous moon. Damnable green mists arise from the lake to meet the moon, and now suddenly the sinister haze is approaching the fated Sarnath. So there's never any question at all that Sarnath is going to die. We know it from the beginning, and we pretty much know why from the beginning. So there's no sense of what's going to happen, and all we get is lots of descriptions of rubies and diamonds and lots of architecture with towers, lots of towers with domes. So people start to get a little afraid because these mists are coming towards them, and the neighboring people that came in to celebrate all start to run for it, but the people who live there aren't really too worried because they've lived with this for 1,000 years. And then close to the hour of midnight, all the bronze gates of Sarnath burst open and emptied forth a frenzied throng that blackened the plain, so that all the visiting princes and travelers fled away in fright, for on the faces of this throng was written a madness born of horror unendurable, and on their tongues were words so terrible that no hearer paused for proof. So, just in typical Lovecraft, we don't actually get to know what this horror was. We just know that these people were horrified and that they couldn't speak of it, of course. So they talked about a horde of indescribable green voiceless things with bulgy eyes, pouty, flabby lips, and curious ears. Why was an ear curious? I think they're cute if they're curious. But apparently they're indescribable. So they're indescribable, but they just look like fish people. Oh, things would dance horribly. We're back to this horrible dancing. And then it seems like the people of the city have morphed into these things, the nobles and the slaves. All right, so these nobles had gone out and gathered up slaves and brought them against their will to the city to, serve them food and clean their halls and everything else. And now these poor slaves have been turned into indescribable green voiceless things. But how is this a curse? Maybe this is a good thing. I mean, we started this all thinking that these horribly dancing people were pretty innocent little happy folk. And now we're saying that it's a punishment for the rich and famous people of this city to be green and have flabby lips and have curious ears and to dance horribly. So I'm a little iffy about that. I'm happier thinking not that they were turned into these things, but that these things have come down and are now happily living in the big city, and the actual people were drowned. I'm going to go with that. Let me just read this. I've read this a bunch of times, but I want to make sure that it doesn't say that it was them. Yeah, see, it just says that the men whose eyes were wild with fear shrieked aloud at the sight within the king's banquet hall, where through the windows were no longer the forms of the nobles and slaves, but the horde. So, the first couple of times I read this, it made it seem like the people were getting turned into the horde, but now I think that the people were being killed, which again is sad for the slaves, because the slaves should have been set free. All right, new theory. The slaves were all set free and were running and fleeing back to their slave homelands and are now safe and free. And the descendants of the warriors who have been celebrating the warriors all this time are the ones who have been drowned in the water, and now the happy green things are dancing horribly, which to them is joyfully, in this place of architecture with domes. So the story of this spread throughout the lands. People were afraid to go there, And even then, only the brave and adventurous young men of distant Felona dared to make the journey, adventurous young men of yellow hair and blue eyes, who are no kin to the men of Nar. Alright, so we started with fishy people, which were gross because they are fishy shaped and danced horribly. And then they were killed off by a bunch of dark people. So all the dark people were the evil warriors that just went around destroying things for no reason at all. And now, 1,000 years later, we have the sane, cautious people who are the yellow-haired, blue-eyed people who are not akin to the dark people. So all of this, very iffy. So they get there. They found no sign of the city. They found no sign of the mines that used to have the rubies and diamonds and everything like that. There's definitely no sign of the original Greystone city that the fishy people were in, and there's no sign at all of the fishy people at all. So nothing's left. So the fishy people, we would say, have gone back to the moon or are hanging out in the water and are happy. The city dwellers have been slaughtered and drowned. This is my hope of the theory. And the slaves have been released and are going back to their homes. And then we say half buried in the rushes was a curious green idol of stone, very ancient, coated with seaweed. And it was the one that had been worshipped beneath the gibbous moon throughout the land of Manar. And they're saying that now it is being worshipped. By who? There's no one left over here. Unless the slaves came back and decided to put little quiet villages along the water and to worship the water lizard. It's still also iffy, if we think 1,000 years back to where we are now. So 1,000 years is, the beginning of the Dark Ages, we can say. It's, before a lot of the Crusades happened. It's before all sorts of things that we think of as culture happened. And do we want to be held responsible for what our ancestors did back then? I mean, we don't even know, most of us. I suppose I'm fortunate that I know that I'm related to King John and King Richard and so on. So I have a sense of what some of my ancestors were doing. And, I don't want to be held accountable for the crazy things that they ended up doing to their peoples. Never mind all the other generations of family members that I don't know about. They could have been completely nasty people. And do I, as a person now, want to be held accountable for them? Now, one could say that if I was going around celebrating the destruction of a city, let's say King Richard slaughtered some sort of a village. And if I went around every year celebrating the destruction of that village and how he put people's heads on pikes and all that other kind of stuff, that would be iffy. Or King John / Prince John and the whole Robin Hood thing. If I went around celebrating how King John and Prince John did really nasty things to people in England, that would also be iffy. But I think for most of us, we have no idea what people were doing 1,000 years ago, and we shouldn't be held responsible for the things that they did. I can see the fish people want to have revenge, but it makes more sense to me for them to have revenge on the actual immediate culture that caused them problems and not people way down the road. Now, I mean, I suppose you could also say these people were out there conquering and subjugating and holding slaves and everything, so they were never really a healthy culture in that sense, and maybe they needed to be taken down. But I'm still also just not keen on this whole waiting 1,000 years before they're going to wreak their vengeance and letting these people go around for 1,000 years subjugating people, slaving people, probably massacring nearby villages so they could steal their stuff and all of that. The fishy people just sat and watched all of this so that in 1,000 years they could have some fun on one particular night. So what are my thoughts about this story? There are way too much descriptions of towers and pillars and ivory thrones and so on that are just dumped. They could have been integrated into like stories of them coming back from some sort of a terrible slaughter and make it more clear that these people are still out there slaughtering and wreaking havoc and need to be taken down. There could have been some sort of a description about why the fishy people waited 1,000 years. Maybe, they were so thoroughly destroyed that it took them 1,000 years to regain their strength to be able to come down from the moon. Or maybe the connection to come down from the moon can't happen all the time. Maybe it's a certain kind of thing, and maybe if they had said more clearly that the moon was in a certain position and all that kind of stuff, that this was finally the chance that the fishy people could have gathered their strength and come down and taught the city a lesson and finally made them stop. And even maybe a sense that the fishy people were frustrated that they couldn't come down earlier and saw all these people being enslaved and tortured and everything else, and they were waiting and waiting until they could come down and take their vengeance. I think I would have liked that kind of a story a bit more. And I also think that there isn't really, I suppose Lovecraft does this all the time. There isn't a sense after all of this buildup of what even happened. We just get a sense that the fishy guys came sweeping in, killed the city dwellers, and then took over, and then took down the city and vanished. So that's a very short, brief celebration of the destruction, I suppose we'll say. I'm not looking at this from a horror point of view. I'm looking at this from a vengeance of the fishy people point of view. I would have liked more description of what happened, rightfully so, to these men. I wonder if other people reading this see it as a horror thing, that these poor innocent men who were just having happy celebrations got cruelly and maliciously cut down by the fishy people. But I seem to be looking at it as hooray for the fishy people and what took them this long to be able to do it, and what happened to them. I want to know if they're now living happy fishy lives in the water, or if they were able to get back up to the moon, and why they came down, and all that kind of stuff. So maybe I should write a fan fiction for this and do it from the fishy people's point of view and describe all of that and talk about how they hated the domes and towers and onyx pillars and ivory thrones and all that kind of stuff, and that clearly it had to go, that this stuff was not meant to be put into these shapes. So those are my thoughts on the story. Let me know if you have any comments or if you agree with me about the whole fishy people thing. I think those were all the comments I wanted to make on this. We'll see. I'll add something in the comments myself if I come across something else. But I think that was the gist of my feelings on this story. Let me know your thoughts, and I hope you have a great day.